A restaurant owner on the verge of bankruptcy allowed a homeless father and his daughter to stay the night. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Tom leaned against the counter of his near-empty diner, staring at the cracked linoleum floor as if the answers to all his problems might be hidden there. The neon sign outside proclaiming Tom's Classic Eats flickered erratically, mirroring the state of his business. The once busy diner had fallen victim to the changing times, with newer, trendier restaurants drawn away the steady flow of customers that had kept the place alive for years. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. The stack of unpaid bills sat accusingly on the counter beside him, and he knew he had no choice but to sell the place. Yet even that seemed like an uphill battle. Who would want to buy a failing business in a neighborhood like this? As rain began to patter against the windows, Tom glanced outside and frowned. Two figures huddled in the alleyway beside the diner, barely visible through the downpour. A man and a young girl, the latter clutching a threadbare coat around her small frame. They looked pitifully out of place, their silhouettes highlighted by the flickering street lamp overhead. Tom's first instinct was to ignore them. He had enough problems of his own without worrying about some vagrants loitering near his property. But as the girl shivered and tucked closer to the man, presumably her father, something in Tom's chest tightened. Grumbling under his breath, he grabbed an umbrella and stepped outside. "Hey!" he called, his voice sharp. "What are you two doing here?" The man looked up, his face etched with weariness and resignation. "We're just trying to stay out of the rain," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with desperation. "We'll leave if we're bothering you." Tom hesitated, his gaze shifting to the girl. Her wide, hopeful eyes met his, and he felt a pang of guilt. She couldn't have been older than 10, and the way she clung to her father's side spoke volumes about their shared struggle. "Come inside," Tom said abruptly, the words surprising even himself. The man looked startled. "Are you sure? We don't want to cause any trouble." "Just for tonight," Tom snapped, as if trying to convince himself as much as them. "Stay out here any longer, and the kid's gonna catch pneumonia." He turned and walked back inside without waiting for a response, leaving the door ajar. Moments later, he heard hesitant footsteps behind him. The warmth of the diner enveloped the pair as they entered. The man helped the girl out of her soaked coat, revealing her thin frame and a threadbare dress that looked 2 sizes too small. Tom busied himself behind the counter, pretending not to notice their obvious discomfort. "Sit wherever you want," he muttered. "There's coffee and water on the table by the window. Help yourselves." "Thank you," the man said softly, his gratitude palpable. The girl, however, was less reserved. "Thank you so much, sir," she said, her voice bright and full of life despite her circumstances. "This place is really nice." Tom grunted in response, unwilling to engage. He watched from the corner of his eye as they settled into a booth, the man pouring himself a cup of coffee, while the girl stared out the window, mesmerized by the rain. Hours passed in relative silence. Tom busied himself with cleaning and paperwork, occasionally glancing at the pair. The man, who introduced himself as David, kept to himself, his posture guarded but not unfriendly. The girl, Sky, was a whirlwind of curiosity, asking questions about the diner and its history. Tom found himself reluctantly answering her. He told her about how he'd opened the place 20 years ago, back when the neighborhood was thriving. He spoke of the regulars who used to fill the booths and the late-night crowds that had once kept the diner alive. "Why don't they come here anymore?" Sky asked, her brow furrowed in concern. Tom hesitated, caught off guard by her sincerity. "People change," he said finally. "Neighborhoods change. I guess this place just isn't what it used to be." Skye nodded solemnly, as if she understood far more than her years should allow. As the night wore on, Tom began to see David and Skye in a new light. They weren't just homeless vagrants. They were a father and daughter clinging to each other in the face of overwhelming odds. Their bond reminded him of his own daughter, Emily, though he hadn't seen her smile like Skye's in a long time. By the time the clock struck midnight, Tom made a decision he hadn't planned on. "You can stay in the storage room for the night," he said gruffly, avoiding their gazes. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." David looked stunned. "We really don't want to impose." "Just take it," Tom interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Thank you," David said again, his voice heavy with emotion. Skye beamed at Tom, her gratitude shining brighter than the flickering neon sign outside. "You're the best, Mr. Tom." Tom waved her off, retreating to his office. As he sat at his desk, staring at the mountain of bills before him, he couldn't shake the image of Skye's smile. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. But, as he leaned back in his chair, a gnawing thought crept into his mind. He had no idea what he'd just gotten himself into. The early morning sunlight seeped through the diner's grimy windows, painting the empty booths with a muted golden glow. Tom stood behind the counter, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and staring at the storage room door. He had barely slept, his mind racing with second thoughts about letting David and Skye stay. When the door finally creaked open, David stepped out cautiously, his posture tense as if bracing for confrontation. Behind him, Skye emerged with her boundless energy, her face lighting up as she spotted Tom. "Good morning, Mr. Tom," she chirped, bounding over to the counter. Tom grunted in response, keeping his eyes on his coffee. "Morning." David approached more hesitantly, his voice low and apologetic. "Thank you for letting us stay last night. It means a lot." Tom waved him off. "Don't mention it. Just try not to get in the way today." David nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. "Of course, we'll stay out of your hair." But Skye had other ideas. As Tom busied himself setting up for the day, she followed him around, peppering him with questions. "How long have you had this diner? Did you always want to be a chef? Do you ever get bored being here all day?" Tom sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Kid, don't you have something better to do?" Skye tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not really, but I can help. I'm really good at setting tables." Before Tom could respond, she grabbed a handful of napkins and began placing them on the tables, humming a cheerful tune. Despite himself, Tom couldn't suppress a small smile. David, meanwhile, kept his distance, watching Skye with a mix of pride and worry. "She's always been like that," he said softly, as if reading Tom's thoughts, "full of energy, no matter what life throws at her." Tom glanced at David, noting the weariness etched into his face. "How long have you two been out on the streets?" David hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A little over a year. It's been hard, but we manage." Tom didn't press further, sensing the weight of the topic. Instead, he returned to his work, occasionally glancing at Skye as she darted from table to table. As the morning wore on, the diner remained mostly empty. A couple of regulars trickled in, their faces etched with suspicion as they noticed David and Skye. One man, a burly construction worker named Hank, muttered under his breath as he sat down at the counter. "What's with the new help, Tom?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward David. "They're just staying here for a bit," Tom replied curtly, hoping to avoid further questions. Hank snorted. "Better watch your stuff. People like that, you never know what they'll take." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he busied himself behind the counter, pretending not to notice the icy stares Hank directed at David. David, for his part, remained calm, keeping his focus on Skye. She had taken it upon herself to refill Hank's coffee, her smile unwavering despite the man's cold demeanor. "Here you go, sir," she said cheerfully, placing the pot back on the counter. Hank grumbled something unintelligible, refusing to look at her. Tom watched the interaction with a knot of discomfort in his chest. He knew Hank wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who harbored such prejudices, and he couldn't deny that he himself had shared similar thoughts in the past. But seeing Skye's genuine kindness met with disdain stirred something unfamiliar in him, an urge to defend her. By the time Hank left, the diner had fallen silent again. David approached the counter, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Thanks for not saying anything back there." Tom frowned. What good would it have done? People like Hank aren't going to change their minds because of a few words. David nodded, his expression unreadable. "Maybe, but it's still hard to just stand there and take it." Tom didn't reply, instead turning his attention back to the empty diner. The day stretched on, uneventful but charged with an unspoken tension. That evening, as Tom prepared to close up, David approached him again. "I know you've already done more than enough for us, but I'd like to help out around here if you'll let me. I used to cook back when I had steady work." Tom raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You're saying you know your way around a kitchen?" David smiled faintly. "I do. I could even prove it if you want." Tom hesitated, torn between his instinct to say no and his curiosity. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, you can make one dish. If it's any good, maybe I'll let you help out." David nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Deal." In the kitchen, Tom watched as David moved with practiced ease, selecting ingredients and working methodically. The aromas that filled the air were unlike anything Tom had ever cooked himself, rich, warm, and enticing. When David presented the finished dish, Tom reluctantly took a bite. The flavors exploded on his tongue, and he found himself momentarily at a loss for words. "Well?" David asked, a hint of nervousness in his tone. Tom grunted, setting down his fork. "It's not bad," David chuckled, recognizing the grudging compliment for what it was. "Glad to hear it." That night, as Tom locked up the diner, he couldn't shake the memory of the meal. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, both for the diner and for the unlikely duo he had let into his life. But he also knew that trust wouldn't come easily, and the road ahead would be anything but smooth. The hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of utensils echoed through the empty diner as Tom stood behind the counter, flipping through a notebook filled with outdated recipes and half-scribbled inventory lists. The place felt different this morning, less like a dying business and more like something stirring awake. It wasn't bustling, not yet, but there was an energy he hadn't felt in a long time. David had been up early, cleaning tables and wiping down the windows. Skye had taken it upon herself to sweep the floors, her small frame darting around the room with a determination that didn't match her size. Watching them work, Tom felt an unfamiliar pang of something close to guilt. "Careful with that broom, kid," Tom called out. "You'll knock something over." Skye grinned at him. "I'm a professional cleaner now, Mr. Tom. No accidents." Tom shook his head, but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. He turned his attention back to the counter, just as the bell above the door jingled. Hank. Tom stiffened, his hands tightening around the notebook. Hank strode in like he owned the place, his heavy boots leaving faint marks on the freshly mopped floor. "Morning, Tom." Hank's eyes immediately landed on David, who was arranging silverware on the tables. "You still got him hanging around here?" Tom's jaw tensed. "Yeah, he's helping out." Hank snorted. "Helping? Or freeloading?" Before Tom could respond, Skye appeared beside him, holding the broom like a scepter. "My dad isn't freeloading," she said firmly, her voice clear and confident. "He's working really hard." Hank's eyes narrowed as he looked down at her. "That so?" Tom stepped in before the situation could escalate. "Look, Hank, if you're here to eat, take a seat. Otherwise, you know where the door is." Hank scowled but dropped into a booth, clearly not ready to let it go. Tom exhaled slowly, glancing at David, who had frozen mid-step. "It's fine," David said quietly. "I'm used to it." Tom didn't like the way those words sounded, but he didn't press. Instead, he focused on making Hank's coffee, trying to drown out the gnawing unease creeping up his spine. Later that day, Tom found David in the kitchen, rolling dough with a practiced ease. The smell of warm spices filled the air and Tom's stomach growled despite himself. "What's this?" Tom asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Experimenting," David replied without looking up. "Figured if I'm sticking around, I might as well try adding something new to the menu." Tom crossed his arms. "I didn't say you could change the menu." David finally looked up, his expression calm but determined. "You also didn't say I couldn't." For a moment, Tom considered shutting the whole thing down. But then he saw Skye at the counter, chatting with a couple of customers who'd wandered in. One of them was smiling at her, and Tom realized it was the first time he'd seen that booth occupied in days. He turned back to David and nodded toward the oven. "Let's see if it's any good." When the dish came out, Tom had to admit, reluctantly, that it wasn't just good, it was incredible. The flavors were bold, but not overpowering, and the presentation made it look like something out of a high-end restaurant. "It'll sell," Tom said finally. David smirked. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," Tom lied, turning away to hide the twitch of a smile. Over the next few days, David's cooking began to draw attention. Word spread quickly, and more people started showing up. Not a flood, but enough to give Tom a glimmer of hope. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, a woman who had been a regular for years stood at the counter, staring at the menu. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Where's the usual food?" Tom opened his mouth to respond, but David beat him to it. "The old menu's still here," he said evenly. "We're just adding a few new options." The woman scoffed. "Not sure I like where this place is heading." Tom bristled, but before he could speak, David stepped back. "Let me know if you change your mind," he said, his tone calm. The woman left without ordering. Tom stared after her, his frustration simmering. "You can't just let people walk out like that." David wiped his hands on a towel. "You can't force them to stay either." Tom wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny that the customers who did stay seemed to enjoy the food, and Skye, always Skye, was winning people over with her endless enthusiasm. Still, the tension lingered. One evening, after the last customer had left, Tom sat at the counter while David cleaned up. "I don't get you," Tom said finally. David looked up. "What do you mean? You just take it. The comments, the looks, you don't fight back." David's expression darkened slightly. "I've fought before. It doesn't always help." Tom frowned. "So what? You just Let people walk all over you? No, David said quietly. I pick my battles. And right now my battle is making sure my daughter has food and a roof over her head. Everything else can wait. Tom didn't respond, but he found himself thinking about those words long after David and Sky had gone to bed. The next day, Tom made a decision. He printed new menus that featured David's dishes alongside the old ones. He didn't announce it or make a fuss, he just did it. When David saw them, he raised an eyebrow. I thought you didn't want to change anything. Tom shrugged. I changed my mind. David smiled. Thanks. Tom grunted. Don't make me regret it. But as the day wore on and more customers came in, some out of curiosity, others because they'd heard about the food, Tom started to think that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't. By the end of the week, the diner felt different. The air was lighter, the tension easing with each new dish that left the kitchen. And for the first time in a long time, Tom didn't dread looking at the cash register when he closed up for the night. But he also knew the real test was still to come. The steady hum of the refrigerator filled the empty diner as Tom leaned against the counter, the overhead lights casting harsh reflections on the polished surface. Outside, the street lights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the dim evening fog. Business had picked up slightly over the past week, enough to keep the lights on for now, but the tension that had taken root in Tom's chest refused to fade. David was in the kitchen, washing dishes while Sky wiped down tables with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything she did. Tom glanced at them, his eyes lingering on Sky's cheerful humming. She reminded him of his daughter, Emily, when she was younger, before things had gotten complicated. The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the quiet. Tom straightened, expecting another customer, but his expression hardened when he saw who had entered. It was Hank. The burly construction worker stomped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. He didn't bother greeting Tom and instead made a beeline for the counter. You got a minute? Hank's tone was sharp and Tom's stomach sank. Tom glanced toward the kitchen where David's silhouette moved behind the pass-through window. Yeah, what's up? Hank leaned in, lowering his voice. I've been hearing things, Tom. People are talking about how this place has changed, and not in a good way. Tom stiffened. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Hank's eyes darted toward the kitchen. You let one of them take over your kitchen, and now half the neighborhood's acting like this place isn't for them anymore. Tom felt his pulse quicken, his grip tightening on the counter's edge. He's not taking over. He's helping, and he's a damn good cook. Hank snorted. Doesn't matter how good he is. People don't feel comfortable here anymore. You're losing your regulars, Tom. Maybe it's time to rethink who you're letting hang around. Tom's anger flared, but before he could respond, Sky appeared beside him, her bright smile cutting through the tension. Hi, Mr. Hank. Want some coffee? Hank barely glanced at her. Not today, kid. Sky's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, darting back to the tables. Tom watched her go, his chest tightening. She's a kid, Hank, Tom said, his voice low. David's just trying to take care of her. Yeah? Hank stepped closer. And what about you? You're trying to keep this place alive, right? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're letting it die. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. Later that night, after David and Sky had gone to the storage room to sleep, Tom sat alone in the diner, replaying Hank's words. He hated to admit it, but Hank wasn't entirely wrong. Business had changed. Sure, there were a few new faces, but some of the regulars, The ones who'd kept the place running for years had stopped coming altogether. Was he making a mistake? The thought gnawed at him, but every time he tried to convince himself to cut ties with David, he remembered Sky's smile. The next morning, Tom found David in the kitchen, carefully slicing vegetables. "We need to talk," Tom said, leaning against the doorway. David set down the knife and wiped his hands on a towel. "What's wrong?" Tom hesitated, then let the words spill out. "Some of the regulars, they're not happy about you being here. They think I'm changing the place too much." David's expression hardened, but he didn't look surprised. "And what do you think?" Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "I think I need this place to survive." David's shoulders tensed. "And you think I'm hurting it." "I didn't say that," Tom snapped, but the defensiveness in his tone betrayed him. David exhaled slowly, his eyes steady. "I get it. You don't know if you can trust me, and maybe your customers don't either. But I've been through this before, Tom. I've lost jobs, good jobs, because people didn't want someone like me working in their kitchens." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" David leaned against the counter, his voice quieter now. "I used to work at a fancy restaurant downtown. Sous chef, I was good, damn good. But the owners, they didn't like that their image didn't match the guy running the kitchen. Started cutting my hours, giving my dishes to other chefs. Eventually, they found an excuse to let me go. Said I wasn't a team player." Tom felt a pang of guilt. "I didn't know." David shrugged. "Didn't think you'd care." The words stung, but Tom didn't argue. That afternoon, a group of teenagers loitered outside the diner, shouting and laughing. Tom didn't pay much attention until he heard a loud crash. He rushed outside to find one of the windows shattered, a brick lying on the ground nearby. The kids scattered, their laughter echoing down the street. David appeared in the doorway, Sky peeking out from behind him. "What happened?" David asked. Tom shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Nothing. Just some punks." But as he looked at the broken glass, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling that it wasn't random. The vandalism was only the beginning. Over the next few days, graffiti appeared on the walls, slurs and insults that made Tom's stomach churn. Customers started whispering, and the tension in the diner grew thicker. David tried to keep his head down, but Tom could see the strain wearing on him. Sky stopped smiling as much, her usual energy dimmed by the hostile stares and muttered comments. Finally, Tom snapped. He stood in the middle of the diner one afternoon, his voice booming. "If you've got a problem with how I run this place, you know where the door is. But if you're here to eat, then sit down and act like decent human beings." The room fell silent. David stared at Tom, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Sky beamed. "Go, Mr. Tom." That night, Tom locked up the diner and sat down across from David. "I'm not kicking you out," Tom said firmly, "but I need to know you're in this for the long haul." David met his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." Tom nodded. "Good." As they sat in the quiet, Tom realized something had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting to save his diner. He was fighting for something bigger, a chance to prove that change was possible, even in a place like this. And he wasn't fighting alone. The diner's broken window had been patched up with plywood, but the scars it left ran deeper than the jagged edges of the glass. Tom stood behind the counter, watching David and Sky through the pass-through window in the kitchen. The tension that had built up over the past week lingered like the scent of burnt coffee, refusing to dissipate. Sky hummed softly as she wiped down the tables, her energy a fragile echo of its former brightness. David moved through the kitchen with practiced precision, but Tom could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he avoided meeting Tom's gaze. Tom didn't blame him. The graffiti, the broken window, the stares from customers who came in just to gawk at the man cooking in the kitchen, it was enough to break anyone. But David hadn't broken. If anything, he seemed more determined, more focused. And that determination had started to rub off on Tom. It was nearing closing time when the front door swung open and a group of men stepped inside. Tom recognized them immediately. Local contractors who often grabbed lunch between jobs. They weren't regulars anymore, not since David had started cooking, and their presence now felt deliberate. The tallest of the group, a man named Rick, leaned against the counter, his eyes sweeping over the diner. "Heard you had some trouble here, Tom." Tom tightened his grip on the rag he was using to clean the counter. "Nothing we couldn't handle." Rick smirked. "That so? Because it looks like this place is falling apart." Tom felt his pulse quicken, but before he could respond, David stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Rick's smirk widened. "Yeah, you can help by packing up and leaving. This neighborhood doesn't need charity cases pretending to be chefs." Skye froze mid-step, her eyes darting between David and the men. Tom saw the fear in her face, and something inside him snapped. "That's enough," Tom said, his voice low but firm. "You're in my diner, and if you can't treat people with respect, you can leave." Rick's smirk vanished. "You serious?" "Dead serious," Tom said, stepping out from behind the counter. "You want to insult someone, do it somewhere else." For a moment, it seemed like Rick might push back. But then he shrugged and turned to leave, the others following close behind. As the door swung shut, Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. David's voice broke the silence. "Thanks." Tom met his gaze. "Don't thank me. Just keep cooking." Later that night, as Tom locked up the diner, he found David sitting at one of the tables, staring at the plywood covering the broken window. "Can't sleep?" Tom asked, pulling out a chair. David shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Tom nodded. "Yeah, same here." For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, grounding them in the familiar rhythm of the diner. Finally, David broke the quiet. "I'm not going to let them scare me off." Tom looked at him. "Good, because I need you here." David's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Tom leaned back in his chair. "This place. It's been my life for a long time. But lately, I've been wondering if that's enough. Watching you and Skye, seeing how hard you're willing to fight for her, it's made me think. Maybe it's time I started fighting too." David studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's fight." The next morning, Tom and David got to work. David focused on the kitchen, refining the new dishes he'd added to the menu. Tom handled the front, talking to customers and making sure Skye had something to do to keep her busy. Word started to spread about the diner's transformation. People came in out of curiosity, drawn by the rumors of the new chef and his unusual menu. But the vandalism didn't stop. One evening, Tom arrived to find the diner's exterior spray-painted with racial slurs. Skye burst into tears when she saw it, and David's face darkened with anger. Tom clenched his fists. "We're cleaning this up. Tonight." They worked late into the night, scrubbing the walls and repainting the exterior. By the time they were finished, their clothes were stained with paint and sweat, but the diner looked clean and welcoming again. David leaned against the wall, wiping his forehead. "They're not gonna stop." Tom nodded. "Then neither will we." The next day, Tom decided to take a bigger risk. "We're hosting a community dinner," he announced as David prepped ingredients in the kitchen. David looked up. "A what?" "A dinner. Free meals for anyone who shows up. We'll show this neighborhood what we're about." David hesitated. "We can't afford that." Tom grinned. "We can't afford not to." The community dinner was a gamble, but it paid off. People came, some out of curiosity, others because they genuinely wanted to support the diner. David worked tirelessly in the kitchen, and Tom moved from table to table, making sure everyone was taken care of. By the end of the night, the tension that had hung over the diner for weeks seemed to lift. People lingered, chatting and laughing, and Tom caught glimpses of hope in their faces. But not everyone was happy. Rick showed up near the end of the night, leaning against the doorframe with a sour expression. "This doesn't change anything," he said. Tom didn't bother responding. Instead, he turned back to the customers, his focus unwavering. As the last guests left, David emerged from the kitchen, his apron stained but his face glowing with satisfaction. "We did it," he said. Tom nodded. "Yeah, we did." Sky ran up to them, beaming. "Mr. Tom, that was amazing. Can we do it again?" Tom laughed. "We'll see." That night, as Tom closed up the diner, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. The graffiti, the stares, the whispers, they were all reminders of how much work still lay ahead. And yet, as he locked the door and glanced back at David and Sky, he felt something else too: hope. The buzz of the diner's neon sign cut through the early morning haze as Tom stood at the counter, scribbling numbers into a worn ledger. The faint scent of coffee and baked goods lingered in the air, but beneath the familiar comfort, an undercurrent of tension still pulsed. The community dinner had been a victory, but Tom knew it was only the first step. He looked toward the kitchen, where David was already hard at work. The clatter of pots and the steady rhythm of a knife against the cutting board filled the quiet space. Across the room, Sky was setting out napkins and silverware, humming to herself as she arranged each table with careful precision. For the first time in weeks, the diner felt alive. Yet Tom couldn't shake the feeling that it was balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from toppling. David stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "We're low on flour and eggs," he said, his voice calm but edged with worry. "I can make it through today, but we'll need more by tomorrow." Tom grimaced. "I'll figure it out." David nodded, but Tom could tell he wasn't convinced. Supplies cost money, and money was still tight. Despite the recent uptick in customers, the damage done by weeks of vandalism and lost business wasn't easily undone. The bell above the door jingled, and both men turned to see who had entered. It was Emma, a local reporter who had stopped by the community dinner. She smiled as she stepped inside, holding a notepad and pen. "Morning, Tom. David," she said cheerfully. "Mind if I ask a few follow-up questions about the dinner?" Tom glanced at David, who shrugged. "Sure," Tom said, forcing a smile. "What do you want to know?" Emma took a seat at the counter, flipping open her notepad. "Word around town is that your dinner was a big hit. People are saying it felt like the old neighborhood again. Was that the goal?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, we wanted to remind people what this place used to be. A place where everyone felt welcome." Emma jotted down notes. "And what about the changes to the menu? I hear David's cooking is a big part of the draw now." Tom glanced at David, then back at Emma. "He's brought something new to the table, literally. People seem to like it." David smirked. "Glad to hear it." Emma's smile widened. "It's a great story, Tom. A diner fighting to survive, bringing the community together. It's the kind of thing people need to hear right now." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "We're just trying to keep the lights on." Emma didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she thanked them for their time and promised to send over a copy of the article once it was published. After she left, David leaned against the counter. "You think it'll help?" Tom shrugged. "Couldn't hurt." But even as he said the words, a flicker of doubt lingered. He'd seen what happened when things started going well, how quickly people tried to tear it all down. By midday, the diner was busier than it had been in months. Customers filled the booths and tables, their conversations mingling with the clatter of dishes and the sizzle of food on the grill. Tom moved through the crowd with practiced ease, taking orders and refilling drinks. David worked nonstop in the kitchen, his focus unwavering. But as the day wore on, Tom noticed a shift in the atmosphere. A group of teenagers lingered near the entrance, their laughter sharp and mocking. Tom recognized a few of them, kids from the same crowd that had vandalized the diner weeks earlier. One of them leaned against the doorframe, smirking as he watched David through the pass-through window. "Nice place you've got here," the boy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks real, inclusive." Tom stepped forward, blocking the view. "You need something?" The boy shrugged. "Just looking." "Well, look somewhere else." The boy's smirk faltered, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked out, his friends following close behind. Tom exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. That evening, after the diner had closed, Tom sat at one of the booths with David and Sky. The lights were dim, and the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. "We need to do more," Tom said finally. David raised an eyebrow. "More? We can't just rely on what we've done so far. People are paying attention now. We need to keep that momentum going." David frowned. "And how do we do that?" Tom leaned forward. "We make this place stand out. Special events, themed nights, whatever it takes to keep people coming back." David hesitated. "That's risky." "So is doing nothing." Sky piped up, her voice bright. "We could have music nights. People love music." David chuckled. "You just want an excuse to sing, don't you?" Sky grinned. "Maybe." Tom tapped his fingers against the table, considering the idea. "Music, huh? It's not a bad place to start." Over the next few days, the diner transformed. Tom and David worked together to create a schedule of events, live music, trivia nights, and themed dinners. Sky made colorful posters to hang in the windows, and Emma helped to spread the word through her article. The response was immediate. Customers started showing up not just for the food, but for the experience. The diner buzzed with energy, and for the first time Tom began to believe they might actually make it, but the threats hadn't gone away. One evening, as Tom was closing up, he found a note taped to the door. "You don't belong here." Tom's stomach dropped. He tore the note down and shoved it into his pocket, but the words lingered. The next morning, David found him in the kitchen, staring at the note. "We should call the police," David said. Tom shook his head. "And what? Wait for them to do nothing?" "No. We handle this ourselves." David frowned. "How?" Tom looked up, determination hardening his features. "We keep going. We show them we're not afraid." David nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it." That night, the diner hosted its first live music event. Sky convinced David to let her sing, and by the end of the night, the entire room was clapping and cheering. Tom watched from the counter, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they were winning. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. The echo of applause lingered in the air long after the last customer left the diner. Sky's voice still seemed to resonate through the walls, her youthful energy filling every corner of the space. Tom leaned against the counter, watching David lock up the front door. "That went better than I expected," Tom admitted. David smiled, the tension that had lingered in his shoulders for weeks finally starting to fade. "She's got a gift, that's for sure." Tom nodded, but his thoughts were already moving ahead. The evening had been a success, maybe too much a one. As the crowd had poured in, Tom couldn't help but notice the sharp glances and whispers from a few familiar faces. Not everyone had come to support the diner's revival. Some had come to judge, to wait for it all to fall apart. "Did you see Rick?" Tom asked, his voice low. David's expression darkened. "Yeah." He didn't look happy. "No," Tom agreed, "he didn't." David sighed, wiping down the counter. "You think he's going to try something again?" Tom stared out the window, where the dim glow of the streetlights barely touched the shadows. "I think he already is." The next day brought a wave of optimism and a storm of tension. The diner opened early, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries drawing in customers almost as soon as the "open" sign lit up. Word about the music night had spread, and regulars were already asking about the next event, but not everyone was there for the food. Rick returned, this time with a few others in tow. They took a booth in the corner, their eyes following David's every move. Tom kept his composure, but the weight of their presence pressed against his chest. Sky noticed too. She leaned in close to Tom as he poured her a glass of milk. "They don't like us, do they?" Tom froze, then forced a smile. "Don't worry about them, kid. They're just curious." Sky didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned her focus back to her coloring book, her crayon strokes slow and deliberate. David emerged from the kitchen with a tray of food, his steps steady but tense. As he passed Rick's table, one of the men muttered something under his breath. David didn't react, but Tom saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. Tom walked over, his voice sharp. "Everything okay over here?" Rick leaned back, smirking. "Sure, Tom. Just admiring the new chef. You don't see talent like that every day." Tom's patience snapped. "If you're here to eat, order something. Otherwise, get out." Rick's smile faded, replaced by a cold stare. "You really think you're going to turn this place around with him in the kitchen? People don't forget, Tom. They don't forget who belongs and who doesn't." Tom stepped closer, his voice low. "You're right. People don't forget. And neither will I." Rick stood, towering over Tom. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might spiral out of control. But then David stepped forward, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. "It's not worth it," David said quietly. Rick laughed. "Listen to your cook, Tom. He knows his place." Tom watched them leave, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. That night, the diner's windows were smashed. Tom arrived early the next morning to find the glass shattered, shards scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in spray paint, slurs and insults that burned into his vision. David arrived minutes later, his face hardening as he took in the damage. Sky trailed behind him, her eyes wide with fear. Tom knelt beside her, his voice steady. "It's okay, kid, we'll fix it." But she didn't look convinced. They spent the day cleaning up, replacing the glass and scrubbing the walls. Customers stopped by to offer help, but Tom could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. By evening, exhaustion weighed on all of them, but the diner was back in order. David sat at one of the booths staring at the repainted walls. "They're not going to stop," he said finally. Tom sank into the seat across from him. Then we won't either. David's eyes narrowed. You really think we can win this? Tom nodded. We already are. The next event at the diner drew even more people. This time it wasn't just locals. Emma's article had attracted attention and a few reporters showed up to cover the story. David worked tirelessly in the kitchen, while Skye ran drinks and greeted customers with a smile that seemed to defy the chaos of the past few days. Tom watched her, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in a long time, pride. But Rick wasn't done. Halfway through the night, he appeared in the doorway with a group of men. This time, he didn't sit down. He stood there watching. Tom approached him, his voice calm but firm. You're not welcome here. Rick smirked. Can't stop people from standing on a public sidewalk, Tom. Tom took a step closer. Maybe not, but I can make sure everyone here knows exactly what kind of person you are. Rick's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. This isn't over. Tom watched him leave, his shoulders tight. By the end of the night, the diner was quiet again. David sat at the counter, staring into his coffee. You think they'll come back? He asked. Tom nodded. Probably. David sighed. I can't keep putting Skye through this. Tom leaned forward. You're not. She's tougher than you think. David looked over at Skye, who was asleep in one of the booths, her head resting on a stack of napkins. I hope you're right. The following week, the community rallied around the diner. Customers showed up in droves, some bringing supplies, others just offering words of encouragement. But the threats didn't stop. Notes appeared on the door and phone calls came late at night. Tom and David refused to give in. One evening, Emma returned, this time with a camera crew. We're doing a feature, she said. People need to see this. David hesitated, but Tom nodded. Let's do it. The interview aired the next day, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, and the diner saw more customers than ever before. By the end of the week, Tom stood outside, watching the crowd inside the diner. David joined him, wiping his hands on a towel. You were right, David said quietly. We're winning. Tom smiled. Not done yet. But as they turned to go back inside, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Tom stood outside the diner, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The windows gleamed, freshly cleaned and intact for the first time in weeks. Inside, the hum of activity had already begun. David prepping in the kitchen, Skye setting tables, and the low murmur of early customers filtering in through the glass. For the first time in months, the diner felt steady. Not safe, maybe, but stable. Like a foundation had been laid. No matter how much pressure came down on it, it wouldn't crack. Tom's gaze drifted to the newly painted sign above the door. It still read Tom's Classic Eats, but the letters were sharper, brighter. The name hadn't changed, but the place had. And so had Tom. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and Skye's voice rang out from across the room. Morning, Mr. Tom. Tom smiled, her cheerfulness as infectious as ever. Morning, Skye. David appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. We're out of onions again, he said with a hint of frustration, though his eyes held none of the tension they had in the past. Tom shook his head. I'll grab some later. Don't worry about it. David nodded, disappearing back into the kitchen. Watching him go, Tom marveled at how far they'd come. A few months ago, David had been just another face in the alley outside, and now he moved through the diner as if he belonged there, because he did. Tom turned to Sky, who was meticulously arranging salt shakers on the tables. "How'd you sleep, kid?" "Great," Sky beamed. "Dad and I talked about maybe getting a real apartment soon." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah?" Sky nodded eagerly. "Yep. Dad says we're finally saving enough to start looking. He said it'll have a real kitchen and maybe even a room just for me." Tom felt an unexpected pang in his chest, a mix of pride and something close to sadness. He wanted this for them. They deserved it. But he also knew how much he'd miss having them around. "That's great, Sky," he said, forcing a smile. "You'll have to invite me over when you find a place." "Deal," she said, holding out her pinky. Tom laughed and hooked his own pinky around hers. The moment was interrupted by the bell above the door. Tom turned to see Emma walk in, her camera bag slung over one shoulder. "Morning, Tom," she said, her tone light. "Busy already?" "Not too bad," Tom replied. "What brings you in?" Emma grinned. "You, actually. The article's been getting a lot of attention. People want a follow-up." Tom raised an eyebrow. "A follow-up? We're just running a diner, not saving the world." Emma's grin widened. "Maybe not, but people love the story. It's about resilience, second chances, stuff that gives people hope." Tom glanced toward the kitchen where David was shouting orders to Sky, who darted past with a tray of glasses. Hope. Yeah, that sounded about right. Later that afternoon, as the lunch rush died down, Tom and David finally had a chance to catch their breath. They sat in one of the booths, their plates half-eaten and coffee cups nearly empty. "You really think this is it?" David asked, gesturing towards the diner. "That we've made it?" Tom shrugged. "We're still here, aren't we?" David smiled, but it faded quickly. "I've been thinking about what's next," he said carefully. "For me and Sky." Tom set down his coffee cup. "Yeah?" "We're looking at apartments. It's time we found someplace permanent." Tom nodded slowly. "You should. She deserves that." David hesitated. "But I don't want to leave this place behind. I was thinking, maybe we make this official. I stay on as your partner. We split the work and the profits." Tom blinked, caught off guard. The thought had crossed his mind, but hearing David say it out loud made it real. "You serious?" Tom asked. David nodded. "As serious as I've ever been." Tom leaned back, letting the idea settle. He'd spent years running this place on his own, and the thought of sharing it, of trusting someone else to care as much as he did, should have scared him. But it didn't. "Let's do it," Tom said, and David's face lit up with relief. Over the next few weeks, everything started falling into place. The diner officially reopened under shared ownership, and Tom couldn't help but laugh when David insisted on adding his name to the sign. Tom and David's Classic Eats. The neighborhood responded with overwhelming support. Customers poured in, drawn not just by the food but by the story behind it, a story of struggle, redemption, and community. And through it all, Tom watched as David and Sky finally began to build the life they'd been dreaming of. One evening, as the last customers trickled out, David approached Tom with a nervous smile. "Sky wanted me to tell you something," David said. Tom glanced toward the booth where Sky sat, grinning from ear to ear. "What's that?" David hesitated, then smiled. "She says she's decided to invite you to dinner at the new apartment." Tom laughed, the sound echoing through the empty diner. "I'll be there." Months passed, and the diner continued to thrive. Emma's articles had turned it into a local landmark, and David's cooking had earned a reputation that drew people from across the city. But for Tom, the real success was something simpler. the way the diner had become a home again, not just for him but for everyone who walked through the door. And as he stood behind the counter one evening, watching David and Sky laugh with a table of customers, he realized something else. This wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a family. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Watch other videos on our channel and share this video with your friends. It helps us tell more stories like this. See you in the next video.